Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. The November solo show. What else would it be about other than So Below, the event Austin and I held with my neighbour Avalon in Melbourne this past weekend? And I guess I'll give you a little bit of an origin to why we landed on this as a particular topic area. And it relates to Austin being at a previous astrological conference this year and sort of generally realizing that the time has come on both the astrology side and magic side. There's interest on both ends of that for where these things overlap, because obviously, spoiler alert, from an historical perspective, the overlap is approximately 100%, right? So the interest on the astrology side at the conference was quite fascinating. There obviously, I would say, the majority of the people there had a background in astrology rather than magic, and you could see very specific questions coming up. So I'd mentioned some grimoires and that asked which ones are they or what was it, and towards the end, because I could see the sort of lean forward realization that a lot of people were looking to form a coherent initial opinion of magic. So I could hear scribbling down when I recommended Real Magic by Dr. Dean Radin. He's been on the show. As a good starting place, if you want to form a coherent opinion about why you should, well, at least have an opinion about magic, right? And in a way, it sort of makes sense that sort of magic is emerging on the astrological side. And this is in reference to what we looked at in the last solo show. This is what, at least in my interpretation, this is what a return of occult thinking that we're seeing in the wider culture looks like as it interfaces with, you know, a more sophisticated audience than, say, the broad Netflix audience, right? And so it shouldn't be surprising that that astrology, which did not have a particularly good 20th century, neither did magic, to be fair, is getting that haunted treatment. And the interest on the magical side, as far as I can tell, in that it reflects my experience over the last decade, and a number of other premium members, for instance, comes from these, I guess, latter days of the grimoiric renaissance, when at least a few people actually take the evocation structure seriously rather than, you know, simply collecting new books. Because it just doesn't work unless you get the timing right. And the timing is astrological. So that kind of irritant creates a pearl, which is, I guess I need to know at least something about this. And in a funny way, because of that, and it's sort of pleasing because it's stereotypically opposite ends of the spectrum, I suppose, having an astrologer on one side and a chaos magician on the other. And I mean, it's a good point. Like, why a chaos magician? And principally, but not exclusively, it is the efficacy that I just mentioned. This stuff works better if you get the timing right, or at least works at all if you get the timing right. So there's sort of no excuse from a chaos magic perspective to have an adequately robust understanding of magical timing. And it's a quite good example of something that sometimes I think needs to be revisited. Chaos magic's epistemological tools are now significantly more robust than they were 30 years ago, right? And it is something I have to address every few years, either for my own satisfaction or for other people who read the blog or listen to the show or what have you. But it is absolutely what I am in my bones. And and this thought occurred to me on Monday when I took a high dose of LSD, timed to the Jupiter Kazemi, and went wandering the lanes of and alleys of like Fitzroy and Collingwood, where I was staying, kind of interacting with the graffiti, which is an extremely 90s mood, obviously, and it kind of appealed to me in that joking, yep, still chaos magic way, right? And sometimes I think about doing, and maybe I will, but sometimes I think about doing another post-series on it if these epistemological tools are now significantly more robust. But the reality is most of it is in pieces of 8, like that and Pete Carroll's latest books are sort of the mast you lash yourself to. And I describe it that way because, I mean, witness the most recent election. Chaos magic is on, I guess you could say, a similar but different trajectory through garbage to hopefully goodness that we find in, witchcraft and other fields sloshing around popular culture. And hopefully for the same reason. And in both cases, it's because these are significantly emotive terms and words that you obviously can't copyright. So, chaos and magic you put together and you end up in that dank internet or Russian mastermind world. And the same thing with witchcraft. No one owns the word. So as this stuff gets closer to the surface, they're not the same thing, but the terms are sloshing around. So that's generally what I mean about the trajectory through garbage to goodness. Sidebar, and this is a prediction. The next cab of this particular rank, I predict, will be spiritualism, and it will not be a moment too soon. My evidence for that is not just general feels, but also that the premium members have been talking about it for around a year. They also voted for the Q1 2019 course to be, I guess, Venn overlapped with it. But I think it's ripe for a haunting and return to dominant of witchcraft prominence, given that it has, I think, profound implications for the sort of feminism closed with the sun that we were talking about before, right? Because many of the hits against it, sure, it's filled with fraud like everything else, historically and presumably contemporaneously, but many of the hits against it were wholly sexist. So it's one of those things that I expect will, and hope, will righteously reassert itself. But anyway, that's just my prediction around what I think the ongoing dominant of witchcraft haunting of culture looks like. And when it comes to astrology, which is a really good example, much like witchcraft, of it being everywhere at different depths of sophistication in culture at the moment. That's just what happens. What I said to Susie a couple of weeks ago, that even as a metaphor, and this comes back to chaos magic, right? Even as a metaphor, like if you think it does not work at all, it is no longer tenable to sideline astrology. And I absolutely get what Pete Carroll did early on, in the 80s and 90s, because 20th century astrology was a toilet filled with nonsense, right? So I absolutely get why you go, no, this is garbage, right? But one, astrology's grown up significantly since then, but again, we come back to these epistemological tools. Something I said at the end of the magical geography course, and it's a question I posed at the event last weekend. How big is your ecosystem? Even if it didn't work at all, and there are decades of data correlation experiments stretching right back into the Soviet Union and wherever that suggest it does in some way, so just remember that. This is a discourse or a full ontology that allows us to think with sky-ground relationships and our understanding of fate and time and mythology and psychology and just general interconnectiveness, and not just up-down, because you can even horizontalize that thinking out into the more than human world by way of things like the technical Hermetica. This was our language for living in an animate universe. It's just that astrology has been through quite a number of metaphysical traumas from my perspective. So trying to survive, and it's tried to science itself up a couple of times. It's hid in Neoplatonism and so on. And they're things that happen to it rather than things that I would say, is in the totality of its discourse, particularly on the longer timelines that we were talking about at the event. So this is the language that we used to describe things like probability and, I guess, referencing last week's episode with Eric, things like retrocausation and all that other stuff before we had the metaphysics for them. So it seems to me that the solution isn't to replace them with terms like retrocausation and probability and so on. It's to slide these understandings underneath it, because even just as an experiment, if you start including these traditional terminologies, they give us the possibility of bringing our experience of, time, essentially, of these phenomena across time into alignment. So it sort of gives it the Jacques Vallée treatment, if that makes sense, because, of course, what Jacques Vallée did was realize that the 20th century UFO phenomena exists on a spectrum that includes fairies and dragons and other ways of describing something fundamental in the universe. Now, probability and fate and psychology and all this stuff and how we operate on the planet and how our planet operates, the language we used for that is in here. And this is what I mean by you can be as stringently Carolian in your chaos magic as you want. Fine. I don't think it's tenable anymore. I think one of the epistemological tools we have is that method of bringing into alignment a continuity of human experience. And a lot of that is in there in the astrological kind of semiotics, I suppose. So I have this, I'm going back to my food pyramid metaphor, which I use all the time, as you know, even though the food pyramid itself is junk science. So I would suggest, even just while you listen to this podcast and put it in your head, thinking about astrology in a kind of food pyramid shape. At its base, it is a useful and frankly pleasant metaphor for thinking with fate and psychology and personal development and all that kind of stuff. And you can just say metaphor and be fine with it. Let's call this the imaginal level. You can see why Jung had such an interest in it, right? Because there are a sort of full expression of human psychology and calamity and hope and so on. You can see how useful it is at that level. And the next level up is the ecosystem one that I just sort of mentioned. Here we have a language for thinking about us on a planet, our planet in space, and the whole thing in terms of a waveform or cycle model. So at the next level up, we're starting to incorporate improved understandings. I'm not going to say correct, I'm going to say improved or less inaccurate, because I think double negatives correctly jar our thinking. So at that level, we can start to think about what it is to be on a planet and what a planet is and deep time, essentially. So you kind of have the imaginal and then almost the scientific in a classical materialist sense. And then the next level after that is that, again, empirically, it is a broadly predictive system in the long term, looking at the longer trends. And it is more or less precisely predictive on the individual level, particularly if you lean into it. And I invite you to develop your own metaphysics around why that might be so, how it is that it can be broadly predictive. Again, we have the data correlation experiments for it, on really long and large scale, and how it can be precisely predictive and it getting better if you lean into it, because that's a challenging thing to solve. At a broad level, it slightly works, which is to say, above chance correlations, right? But it can, and anyone who's out there, I know a lot of you are into it, good for you, but like you will, you can look at your chart and you can look at what you've got coming up and things will land to the day. Now, it doesn't necessarily do that on the broad level, but it does on the individual. That needs to be solved to your own satisfaction. I have some extremely speculative answers as to why that might be so. But think about it. Think about developing your own metaphysics about broadly accurate, big, precisely accurate, small, especially when you lean into it. And at the top of the pyramid, it makes your magic work better. That's another thing that needs to be solved. If you come at it from a magic perspective, you kind of start at the top of the pyramid, like, God damn it, this makes it work better. This makes it work better, right? And it's not just, although I did use the broadly grimoiric way of getting the timing to work in the sigils course, the fact that it works with sigils in the same generalized shape as it does for spirit evocation is significant, because it doesn't mean, as far as I can tell, although this is... as far as I can tell, the spirits aren't sitting there clocking in and out with like punch cards in an early 20th century factory. And unless, of course, and this could well be the case, that sigils work through spirits. But you see what I mean? At the top of the pyramid, it makes your magic work better. And that is another thing that needs to be folded into the metaphysics. So astrologers kind of climb from the bottom of the pyramid up. And people who are coming at astrology from magic start at the top and head down, right? And on that, so what do we do then with this food pyramid? Like something Austin mentioned on stage, which I agree with, and basically because it happened to me, is that you don't have to become an astrologer for this particular framework to be useful in your life. It's the classic, it's like having teeth and not needing to be a dentist. The level of detail in your relationship to astrology is wholly individual and individualized. You may be interested in it. You may be looking for a thing to kind of intellectually go deep on. You may need it in, you may be interested solely in, well, if this is going to make my magic work better, I'm going to get that proficient at it and no more because I have other things I want to do. That is not really a universal prescription for what you should do with this stuff. And that was really kind of in evidence at the event, which was just amazing. So you had astrologers kind of realizing, okay, well, I do this as a job and this stuff works and its fulfillment in the physical is magical. And you had the magic people there kind of heading in the opposite direction. Like, well, if it works for magic, it must be something in the universe. And this is one of the things that I think is worth picking at, to say the least, in this kind of dominant of witchcraft heading into 2019 world, right? And it was just so splendid to be amongst people kicking the tires on that on the weekend. Just incredible. I just want to say thank you to everyone who came and everyone who helped out. There was a bunch of premium members with whom the event would not have happened. And just everyone who really got the vibe, the kind of post-digital find the others vibe. Sitting there and asking good questions and being into the content. And then, as soon as the drinks happen, everyone's there chatting and walking around and enjoying the food and the wine. And that was the bit that we were aiming for. As I said in a post, the most recent post prior to this one, the link will be in the show notes. Austin and I structured it so that it was that kind of find the others party vibe rather than like a seminar. Or sitting there talking and making notes and so on. And there was a personal level for me and sort of growing up in Australia. And I touched on this with Avalon, who was the MC and also, of course, my Huon Valley neighbor when she was on the show. But growing up, Australia really was just an absolute wasteland of credible magical content and magical people. Now, I know that was sort of the vibe in the kind of early 90s anyway. There was not a lot going on that was as good as it is today back then. But yeah, there's how that was in somewhere like the UK, and there's how that was here. So it was just personally wonderful to see how much this has changed, that you can fill an event with magic and magic adjacent people in Melbourne is a remarkable and positive development and improvement on my experience growing up. So that was just amazing. And the discussions in the drinks, like following the talk about other meetups that are happening or should happening, were just, again, splendid. Like, you could feel in the air that this is absolutely the way to do it. This kind of using digital to be in a post-digital world is how this stuff is going to work. Not just here, but wherever it is you happen to be. And it was especially pleasing, and this is a good example of it, right? This is kind of more of that dominant of witchcraft coming through, to see the overlap between traditional herbcraft and permaculture and timing and growing things is more widespread than even I had hoped. Earlier in the week, I went up to see Dan Palmer, who does the podcast Making Permaculture Stronger. He's also been on the show before. And we spoke about how some of that might work or might play out, because he's adjacently interested in it. He's still trying to get some proper design theory into permaculture. But the design theory, as I said, like, needs to emerge out of an improved metaphysics of the universe, right? Because I think that's the base challenge for everything, clearly. And that was really cool. And there were people at the event who are interested in it or starting it or further along in the path. And this is certainly something I'm going to push heavily on in 2019. It's something that I think is a useful exploration for us all. So, yeah, I mean, it was just an amazing event, and we're sort of coming up on 5 or 6 days later, and I'm still processing it. I'm still thinking about what that was and how it worked for people, and how Austin and I felt about it. And you'll find a link in the show notes. I mentioned this. Oh my goodness, the Mercury retrograde challenges. Just speaking of astrology, you'll find a link to the photo post in the show notes of this podcast, which you may have missed if you subscribe to the blog by email, because I sort of did it the next day, and it went out to about 15% of people on the email list twice, and no one else. And I didn't want to spam those poor 15% for a third time, so I just didn't send the email out. And for premium members, by the time you listen to this, the full presentation of So Below will be up in the premium members area, which means it will also be up for Austin and Avalon's patrons sometime soon. I'm recording this extremely early on Thursday morning, and they are unsurprisingly not up. So it's all good. Find wherever you are on those various platforms, and it will be available to you basically within the next 24 hours. And in terms of the show for the rest of the year, I'm thinking about taking some or all of December off after 156 consecutive weeks across 5 countries in 2 hemispheres. People tend to get very busy at this time anyway. And the farm, my goodness, it's my first spring here, obviously, is running rampant. It's like some sort of Jumanji experience now that the weather has warmed up. So I'm not sure how that's going to play. Keep an eye on the blog. We will, of course, do the H1 2019 forecast with Austin. That'll probably be next week's show, because I will, in fact, have various topics on the farm next week. And I'm hoping that one, because we'll all be in the one area, will be able to be live streamed on YouTube. And then, of course, the audio will be available for download on your various podcatchers. But watch the blog and Facebook for those details, because we'll hopefully, if we manage to get that work, be able to do a Q&A, around that. And also there are, in case I do take a couple of weeks off, there are a couple of talks that I'll be speaking at in January. The first will be on January 13th in Brisbane at Eclectica Books. Call Andrea at the store to book your ticket. She's graciously handling the whole thing. Now, that'll be limited to 25 people, just again because of room capacity. And that one's going to be called Speak of the Devil, and it will be a presentation and discussion on the history of the devil and different modes of approaching it as a form found in the grimoires and European folk magic and that kind of stuff. And the next will be the following weekend, and it'll be a brief talk at Illuminate in Coffs Harbour, and it's called What If We're the Aliens? And this will be space viruses and off-planet ruins and the metaphysical implications of all that. Which I kind of cheekily winked at a number of times at So Below. Details for that one are at illuminateaustralia.com. And of course, keep an eye on the blog for further details about both of them. It's just, this is the November solo show, so I'm just kind of updating you on where we are. And that was So Below. That was Space Magic Melbourne style. And do go out and check the presentation in the premium members area. And yeah, keep an eye out. Until next time.